When the Qashqai was introduced to Australia, Nissan changed the name because they were worried it would be called the Nissan Cash Cow. But that's precisely what the Qashqai has become, a runaway success and a breakout hit for Nissan's embattled European operation. It's a rare story of a successful British designed and produced mass market car in the 21st century, and a car that's not only been a hit in the UK, but around the world. David Twohig knows more than most about the Qashqai's development, being the general manager in charge of bringing it to life. He's been kind enough to sit down for an interview, and if you want to learn more about his work on the Nissan Qashqai, Renault Zoe and Alpine A110, he's got a new book out called Inside the Machine. There's a link in the description. Join me and David as we look at the Nissan Qashqai story. Nissan's UK design office was in trouble. Well, all of Nissan was in trouble, but the UK design office was standing a little deeper in the excrement, so to speak. In September 1998, Nissan's financial statement came out, and it became clear they were in desperate trouble. Years of expansion, creating a range of cars to keep up with Japanese competitors like Toyota, had led to a lot of debt. £28 billion worth of debt to be precise, and the banks that loaned the money wanted it back. Nissan's UK design office was part of that new world expansion, and the cars being sold in Europe weren't selling well. The red ink in the European operation was bleeding all over the balance sheet. But in all of this chaos came a knight in shining armour, not on a white stallion though, but in a Renault Kangoo. Renault was suddenly flush with cash after a decade of frugality and lean manufacturing, learnt partly from Japanese car companies and from a series of successful cars like the Clio and the Megane. They bought a 37% stake in Nissan, but rather than a traditional takeover, Renault proposed an alliance with Nissan taking a 15% stake in Renault. The two companies would be run separately, but would share vehicle parts to drive down manufacturing costs. This wouldn't only make Renault more profitable, but would rescue Nissan from the brink and turn it around. Renault brought a new thinking, the crazy idea of making sure that every car they made was profitable. Many of Nissan's European cars failed that test, hence Nissan's fledgling British design office expecting the chop at any moment. But rather than closing, the team got a break. They'd been charged with building their first all-new model, the replacement for the unpopular 5-door Almera. David Twohig became the general manager of the project, and I'll let him take up the story.
We'd had a few vehicles that were, I want to be very respectful to them here, but vehicles like the Almera, Almera Tino, they hadn't set the world on fire. The last generation of Primera, the P12 Primera, folks might remember it with the central instrument panel, that also hadn't been a commercial success. So we really were on our last warning. We had to have a successful vehicle, and a successful vehicle meant a vehicle that would make money. And that was really, I can't exaggerate too much, Andy, how much that was on my mind, that we had a last shot at designing a successful vehicle for Europe. And I was dispatched from Nissan's R&D center in the UK to Japan with about 25 other folks who are willing to up sticks and go to Japan at a moment's notice to continue the development of this project that had been kicked off by our colleagues in Japan. And to very briefly describe the project, it was a sort of a hatchback on stilts. The idea was to do one vehicle that would cover at the same time the kind of traditional hatchback market, but also the small minivan or MPV market, which was really hot at the time. Vehicles like the Renault Megane Scenic, and Nissan had something called an Almera Tino that some of our viewers might remember. And the idea was to sort of do a blend between the two, do a hatchback that was a little bit raised with a higher hip point, better visibility, etc.
It was a great opportunity. The UK team jetted off for a 12-month trip to Japan to bring this car to fruition, codenamed B32A. To cut costs and in the spirit of the new alliance, the car would use a Renault chassis and powertrain. Nissan, led by Carlos Ghosn, stipulated not unreasonably that every car had to make a decent profit, or there wasn't really much point in doing it. The problem was that no matter how much they crunched the numbers, the team couldn't make B32A for any kind of reasonable profit. What's more, the Japanese design concept was bland. It all came to a head in December of 2002. The heads of Nissan looked at the project and decided a car that could barely scrape a profit couldn't go forward. B32A was dead, and with nothing substantial in the pipeline, this likely meant Nissan's whole UK endeavour, including the Sunderland factory, was staring closure in the face. The UK team had failed. Everyone in the room knew this could well spell the end for Nissan in the UK, but one person at the meeting thought Nissan's design team deserved one more chance.
The chief product planner for Nissan, the head honcho of the product planning at the time, was a gentleman called Patrick Palata. And Patrick said to me, David, you know Nissan Murano? And I said, yes, boss. And he said, well, your team are going to do an 80% photocopy of the Murano.
This new vehicle wasn't a guaranteed success. It wasn't even approved. It was just one of Nissan's many future ideas that needed fleshing out. The thinking was that the Murano had been a success in North America. Europe preferred smaller cars, so why not make a smaller copy for Europe? Many of the UK team headed home as a small group remained to try to flesh out this new crossover to convince Nissan to give it funding. The team had a lifeline, but not much more than that. In the late 1990s, the BMW X5 had shown that modern family car suspension could be used for modern 4x4s that didn't want to do serious off-roading. Maybe there was some potential in this small crossover idea.
Folks were moving away from the traditional sort of three-box saloon car or sedan car that had been the mainstay right through the 70s, 80s, and even the 90s. So that segment, sometimes called the D segment sedan or saloon, that really was dying off, and that was perceptible. There were these MPVs around, or people carriers, monospace, whatever label you want to put on them, but they always had a slight taint of not being very fun or not being very trendy. So very practical for taking the kids to school or, dropping doing family business, but they never really set anybody's hearts on fire. Whereas the traditional hatchback vehicles like the Ford Focus, Renault Megane, Toyota Corolla, etc., they were clearly a super practical vehicle with good performance, good fuel economy, etc. So the crossover was really trying to do all of that in one vehicle, having the nice things about the high driving position of a 4x4, ground clearance, but the economy of a hatchback and the sort of family friendly attributes of MPVs or minivans. So it really wasn't an attempt to try and get the best of several types of vehicles and hopefully avoid the worst traits of those vehicles.
The Almera had been a failure in Europe, but rather than trying to beat other car companies at their own game, Nissan would produce a next generation car and beat them to the punch. As the saying goes, skate to where the puck is going and not where it is. The first thing the team needed to decide was which chassis they were going to use.
We looked at using some of the smaller platforms that Nissan had that later went on to underpin vehicles like the Micra, the Note, basically B segment vehicles. But stretching those upwards would have limited us. It would have limited us in things like tire size, fuel tank capacity, ride and handling, etc. So we had a choice of using the Renault platform that underpinned the very successful Megane 2 series. So that was a very successful platform, but we didn't really have a lot of influence on the costs of that platform, the supplier selection for that platform, and we really weren't able to control everything. And we knew from the B32A project that we needed to have control, particularly cost control, over every aspect of the platform. So again, to cut quite a long, complex story short, we pitched to our top management in Japan that, look, we need a new C platform.
If the idea of a new type of vehicle wasn't enough of a gamble, the team were now suggesting Nissan stump up an order of magnitude extra for a new platform, for a project designed by people who'd never designed a car before. It's like putting 100,000 euros on black in Monte Carlo and then being told the minimum stake was a cool $1 million. Yes, the new platform could be reused for other vehicles, but those future vehicles also needed to be approved. The team didn't have much choice though. They needed a four-wheel drive platform, and although Renault or Nissan had four-wheel drive platforms, the Megane Scenic RX4 springs to mind, none fitted the team's technical or cost goals. But on the positive side, this platform filled a gap and the Alliance could make good use of it. This approach had one big advantage over B32A. That project had been held back by the high fixed cost of reusing the Renault platform and powertrains. By designing their own platform, they could tailor it to their vehicle, and that meant higher profit margins. To reduce the cost, they made sure to reuse as many parts from the existing platforms as possible.
So we were able to show the pretty cold, hard facts of the volume effects of the automotive industry, showing, if we source dampers or cooling systems or fuel tanks on this amount of vehicle, it will amortize the R&D effect and the tooling required to create a new platform.
Chief Vehicle Engineer Kimiyasu Nakamura, David's mentor, deserves the credit for pushing the decision to not only approve the vehicle, but also the new platform. Nissan's new crossover was approved, the car that would become the Qashqai. Some have called the Qashqai the first crossover, but that clearly wasn't the case. The Murano was obviously a major influence, but the team also turned to another car for inspiration.
The second vehicle, Andy, that I just, not to tip the hat to in passing, because I think it's a vehicle that doesn't get enough credit, is the little Honda HR-V, the Joy Machine, as it's sometimes known as. And it was a very, very interesting vehicle because at the end of the 90s, early 2000s, it had already, to some extent, anticipated the crossover market.
But the Honda HR-V showed one major problem with this new type of 4x4. They were constantly derided in the press as not being a true off-roader, as if the people who bought these cars were going to scale Ben Nevis on the weekend. Customers didn't care so much for 4x4, it might help on the rare snow day, but what they really wanted was the high driving position. And what they didn't want from a true 4x4 was the excessive body roll and awful fuel economy, a problem that limited 4x4s like this to enthusiasts or the rich. The Qashqai was at an inflection point where the press was starting to realize that customers didn't care about true off-roading, and customers were starting to realize that they could have a taller car without the compromises. But the team wasn't taking any chances. The HR-V's exposed rear beam axle had shown it wasn't a true 4x4. The new Qashqai would also exist in a front-wheel drive only version, but the bodywork would be carefully designed to hide the non-driven rear axle from view. The HR-V wasn't the only car the team would take inspiration from, though. They looked at what they considered the best family hatchbacks and small off-roaders: the Ford Focus, Renault Megane, Toyota RAV4, Subaru Forester, and the Mitsubishi Outlander. But rather than trying to match features like Nissan had done with the 1990s Almera, making a bland car no one would like, the team took inspiration from each one to try to make something that would wrap lots of good elements into a cohesive, appealing package. Work on the Qashqai progressed. With an optimistic projected volume of 120,000 cars a year, the team felt they could make a good profit. By 2004, a rough prototype was ready. Design studios in London and Japan worked in parallel on the Qashqai shape. The London office won out, featuring an unusual design with no pillar between the front and rear seats. This allowed for more flexible interior arrangements, but also gave the car two large glass panels the length of the roof. With this being a new design, the team agonized over the details. How high should the driver sit? Drivers like to sit high, but if it's too high, you feel you're sitting on the vehicle, not in it. Where should the bottom of the windows sit? The devil was in the details. It was presented at the Geneva Motor Show as the Qashqai, the name of a group of tribes in a mountainous region of Iran. The name, like the car, was a risk. It was hard to pronounce, difficult to remember, and harder to spell. The press were skeptical of the Qashqai's shape. Was this really the best of both worlds, or the worst? But Nissan had faith in the car, and the odd-sounding name. The first prototype got the smallest engine in the projected range. If this had enough get up and go, the others would be just fine. Development continued apace, eventually progressing to the final phase, sorting out the fit and finish issues. It was at this point that the team discovered some awkward problems.
So the body design manager, who shall remain nameless, walked up to my desk, and I noticed again, about 6 feet behind him was one of the CAD engineers from the body design. And I thought, okay, here we go, we've got a problem. So they explained to me that we had a problem with the gas strut layout. And the gas struts on the rear tailgate of a vehicle, they seemed quite simple. But in fact, they have to work at extremes of temperature. That means when the gas is hot, they still have to be able to pop the tailgate. They still have to be able to hold the tailgate up in very hot temperatures. And when the gas is cold, they still need to be able to pop the tailgate open and hold it up there. And I remember them explaining to me that, look, we've got some of the calculations wrong, boss. And at cold temperatures, unfortunately, the tailgate is going to fall and like hit you on the head. And then they explained to me that we'd actually also got a problem with the hot temperature condition, so that when you pop the trunk, it would do this and hit you under the chin. So the only solution was not just repositioning the gas strut, but actually changing the cut line on the rear tailgate, which had already been designed frozen. So this required me jumping in my car again, setting off for the design studio again, and explaining to the designers that, sorry guys, we have to move the cut line by a couple of millimeters. And I actually applied the black tape to the clay model myself. I think it's the only time a designer actually allowed me near enough to a clay. So that's the one line on the vehicle that I executed myself, and it's wrong.
But this was all part of the teething problems of bringing a new car to market. And you can forgive a team who'd never designed a car before a few rookie errors. The design team worked harmoniously with the styling team, and when it came to tooling, they worked hand in hand with the production team up in Sunderland. It helped that every Nissan worker, no matter what job they had to work a week on the shop floor to understand how the car actually goes together and how hard these people work. Everyone working on the project had a sense of pride for this new car. It was the only mass-produced car being designed and produced in the UK, and was reversing a trend of British automotive decline. Customer tests were positive, both on the car and the price. But what would the public and press say when it launched? Would it be cool enough to beat an MPV, and more practical than a hatchback? Had Nissan struck the right balance? The new Qashqai launched at the 2006 Paris Motor Show with promises of deliveries just a few months later. It made competition like the new Ford Focus and Toyota's Corolla-based Auris look positively old-fashioned. The large panoramic glass roof showed this was a next-generation car, a trick that only the Peugeot 307 SW had pulled off. Luxury features such as navigation, hands-free calling and heated seats added a touch of luxury. But that didn't mean the Qashqai was expensive. The car had four-wheel drive, but Nissan was aware many people wouldn't need it, so a cheaper front-wheel drive version was also available. But if you wanted four-wheel drive, the Qashqai had a lower price than proper all-wheel drive cars, and better handling and better fuel economy. The press gave it a warm reception. The only minor niggle seemed to be the handling in certain conditions, but it was unlikely that most customers would worry about it. They loved its high commanding driving position and practicality. Like the Ford Escort and Cortina of the 1970s, the Qashqai was a family car that gave people just what they wanted in an affordable package that you felt proud to have on your driveway. Unlike those 1970s Fords, it was British designed and built, which was more than you could say for their successors. The public took to the Qashqai immediately. Nissan of Europe was now more than just the Micra. They had a surefire hit on their hands. Their gamble had paid off, not just for the Qashqai, but for the new platform that over the next few years they could use for a wealth of new cars, beating the competition to market. The Qashqai was exported all over the world, even to Japan as the Nissan Dualis. With such a hit, the company was open to ideas to capitalize on it. One enterprising person in the marketing team dreamt up the idea of making the Qashqai even more practical by adding a third row of seats as the Qashqai Plus 2. It wasn't a trivial change though. The wheelbase needed to be extended 14 centimeters, and to accommodate the extra seats, the whole rear end of the car needed to be altered, including making the car taller. This wasn't cheap. but it was 25 centimeters shorter than the Mondeo while being much more practical. Over its life, 235,000 Qashqai Plus 2s would be produced. Those optimistic estimates of 120,000 cars per year started to look pessimistic as sales climbed. The Qashqai not only shrugged off the 2008 Great Recession, but sales actually grew through the whole period. The competition had been wrong-footed and rushed to catch up. The Qashqai got the usual mid-cycle refresh in 2010. The front end was restyled, soundproofing improved, the instrument panel got an updated display, and Nissan introduced its 360-degree parking camera technology. Minor changes, but enough to keep the Qashqai selling. If the Qashqai, a smaller Murano, could sell well, what about a smaller Qashqai? Nissan introduced the Juke in 2010. It went on to sell well, but the larger, more practical Qashqai sold in greater numbers. With this sales success, there was a lot of pressure on the second generation car to build on its success, with Nissan now selling 200,000 of them every year. They started with Renault and Nissan's new modular platform, but the plan wasn't to make something completely different from the original car. That had been a revolution, and the best thing to do after a revolution is evolution, refining the new thing into being the best it can possibly be. The team developed what they called the 100 Wow strategy. That is, lots of little improvements, which when taken together would produce a truly great vehicle. The new shape would have a lower drag to get better fuel economy, the new chassis would make the car handle better. The headlights were updated, something David Tuheg felt could have been more premium on the first generation car. They added lots of tech, such as a new infotainment system, the obligatory app on your smartphone to integrate search and Facebook into your car that no one used, automatic wipers, dual zone air conditioning, speed sign recognition, and a whole raft of driving assistance aids, including parking assist. Nothing groundbreaking when compared to more expensive competition, but it ensured the Qashqai remained one of the best crossovers on the market. The new version launched in 2013, and it soon became clear the evolutionary approach had worked. The new car was even more popular than the first generation car and became a regular fixture not just of the UK top 10 car list, but the European list as well, the first time Nissan had ever been in the top 10. And all the cars were flowing to European garages from the factory in Sunderland. The second generation Qashqai would only have 5 seats. The new version of the X-Trail, also known as the Nissan Rogue, would take the place of the Qashqai Plus 2 with an option to have 3 rows of seats. It would also share the Qashqai's new platform, as would Renault's new crossover, the Kadjar. Crossovers were the new hotness, and every car manufacturer was jumping on the bandwagon. This meant more competition, such as the Seat Ateca, Peugeot 3008 and Honda HR-V that had been the inspiration for the original Qashqai just a few years earlier. But the Qashqai shrugged off the competition as sales boomed. The Qashqai had been inspired mainly by the North American Nissan Murano, so it was perhaps fitting that the new version would be sold in North America. While it would be known as the Qashqai in Canada, in the US it was the Rogue Sport. There were so many changes for the North American market, the car couldn't be produced on the Sunderland production line, and it was manufactured in Japan. In fact, the Qashqai was now being produced in Japan, China and Russia and exported all over the world. The mid-cycle refresh arrived in 2016 with a new, more purposeful look. Maybe mindful of the Qashqai feeling a little cheap compared to the competition, Nissan focused on improving the look and tactile feel of the materials inside the cockpit. By 2014, Nissan had sold 2 million Qashqais. By 2017, they'd sold 3 million globally. A Qashqai was rolling off the Sunderland production line every 62 seconds, and workers were working 3 shifts a day to keep up with demand. The third generation Qashqai arrived in 2021. Again, this was an evolution over the previous car using the same platform. It was a little larger, giving a bit more space inside, and a little lighter with an aluminium bonnet and composite tailgate. With redesigned rear suspension, the boot gained 50 litres of additional space. For the first time, the Qashqai came as a hybrid, something many rivals were already offering. But with the team chasing the perfect aerodynamic shape, the looks had barely changed. Contrast this to the second and third generation Ford Cortina that were going for dramatically different styles to encourage customers to buy the new fashionable car. But while cars in 1971 sold on their looks, cars in 2021 sold on their new technology. There was the obligatory Apple CarPlay and Android Auto support, a heads-up display, and more premium materials to try to compete with upscale rivals. And there was real attention to detail. The rear doors opened wider for easier access, and the boot deck could be wiped clean to mop up the inevitable spills. But the competition had caught up, and despite the updates, Nissan was finding it harder to compete against the competition. The Qashqai's best days may be behind it. With the switch to a possible electrified future, Nissan started production of the Ariya in 2022, a crossover almost exactly the same size as the Qashqai and designed and built not in the UK, but in Japan. The Qashqai was a revolution in the market. The Ariya may be the next revolution. The Qashqai was born out of a desperate desire not just for a UK design team to create their first vehicle, but also to save UK design and quite possibly manufacturing as well. It marked a break from following others to leading the market by imitating another successful Nissan car, and soon other car companies were imitating the class-leading Qashqai, such as Toyota's RAV4. Not bad going, seeing as Nissan was trying and failing to beat Toyota in the 1990s. It's all thanks to a plucky band of designers and managers, including David Twohig, who took a chance and found creative ways to work around 1,000 problems to produce a car enjoyed by millions. If you want to hear more about the Qashqai, there's an optional extra link on the right. David Twohig's excellent book Inside the Machine is a roller coaster ride of the birth of the Qashqai and his efforts to breathe life into the Renault Zoe and Alpine A110. If you want to find out more, there's a link in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.